She thought she was just saving a stranger's life in the rain. She had no idea he'd return to offer her the world and his heart. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Someone help, he's still breathing. Celine Ramos's voice cracked through the heavy rain, desperate and raw. She knelt on the slick pavement in downtown Riverside, California, her hands pressed to the bleeding chest of a man who had just collapsed at her feet. Streetlights flickered above, casting unsteady pools of light across the nearly empty road. Cars passed by, some drivers glancing but none stopping. Pedestrians picked up their pace beneath umbrellas, avoiding her cries. Her hands shook, but her training kicked in. Without hesitation, she pulled off her own coat and applied it firmly against the wound just below his ribs. Blood soaked through quickly, warm and alarming. He appeared to be in his late 20s, maybe 28, his face pale and twisted in pain even as he lay unconscious. His breathing was shallow and quick. "Hold on," she murmured, scanning the street for help. No sirens. No aid. Just the rain and her pounding heart. She had no medical kit, no team, no backup, and no job. Only 2 days earlier, Celine had been laid off from Riverside General Hospital. Budget cuts, they'd said. Her entire department was eliminated. She had pleaded to stay, offering to take reduced hours, even a lower salary, but none of it had mattered. The ward where she had poured her heart and skills for nearly 6 years had closed its doors on her. But that didn't matter now. She ripped a strip from her blouse and tied it tightly just above the wound, creating a makeshift tourniquet. His pulse was weak but steady. She tilted his head back gently, checking his airway, instinctively following her emergency training despite the cold panic creeping into her limbs. The rain pelted her back. Her knees were soaked. A woman passed by across the street. "Please, call an ambulance," Celine shouted, her voice hoarse. The woman glanced over and then walked faster. Celine blinked away tears. "Unbelievable," she muttered, turning her attention back to the man. He was striking, even now, defined jawline, long lashes darkened by rain. Blood trailed from the corner of his mouth. He didn't belong like this, in the gutter, abandoned. "I'm not letting you die," she growled through clenched teeth. Finally, a siren in the distance, her chest lifted with hope. She waved frantically toward the flashing lights breaking through the rain. "Here. He's losing blood fast." The ambulance screeched to a halt beside her, and 2 paramedics jumped out, rushing to assess the scene. "Stab wound, left thoracic region," Celine reported quickly. "I've applied pressure and a temporary tourniquet. He's unconscious, shallow breaths but reacting to pain." "I'm a nurse, or was," she added quietly. One of the paramedics gave her a quick nod of respect. "You probably saved his life." Celine didn't reply. She stepped back as they secured the man to the stretcher, her coat now completely soaked with blood. "Can I go with him?" she asked, breathless. "Are you family?" "No," she said, hesitating. "I just found him." They exchanged a glance, then shook their heads. "Policy. Sorry, but thank you for everything." She stood on the curb, watching as the ambulance disappeared into the rain. Her coat was gone. Her clothes clung to her skin. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the weight of the night settled in. She didn't know his name, why he'd been attacked, or if anyone would even look for him. But for those 10 minutes in the storm, he had been hers to care for, and she had remembered what it felt like to be a nurse again. The next morning, Celine stood in the cramped kitchenette of her small 1-bedroom apartment, staring blankly at the steam rising from her kettle. The storm had passed, but its chill lingered in her bones. Her coat was gone, her favorite blouse torn, and her only pair of comfortable shoes were still stained red. She hadn't slept. His face haunted her, pale, bleeding, drifting in and out of consciousness. She didn't even know his name. She didn't know if he was still alive. All she could do was pray. She sipped bitter instant coffee, then sat at the small table where her old laptop sat open to yet another job search site. Her inbox overflowed with rejection letters. "Thank you for your application," they all began, but none called her for interviews. Her California nursing license was still valid, but no employer wanted to deal with visa paperwork. She had just weeks before it expired, just weeks before she'd have to leave the country unless she found a sponsoring job. Her family back in the Philippines didn't know yet. Each week she still wired home what little she earned. Her mother needed heart medication and her younger brother was in university. They still believed she was working full-time at the hospital. She couldn't bear to disappoint them. She had managed to pick up under-the-table work at a small diner in downtown Riverside called Sunny Spoon, cash only, long shifts, no benefits. She wiped tables, cleaned floors, and took orders with a practiced smile. No one there knew she used to be a nurse. She didn't want the questions. Or worse, the pity. Most nights, she returned home past midnight, her back sore, her feet blistered, but the hardest part was the silence. In those quiet moments before sleep, she wondered if she'd thrown her future away for a stranger. She didn't regret helping him, not for a second, but the not knowing? That was the part that lingered. Did he make it? She whispered to the ceiling one night. Did I really save him? She had called several hospitals the day after the attack, asking if a young man had come in with a stab wound near 6th and Bennett, but HIPAA laws stopped her cold. No details, no confirmation. Just silence. Still, his face clung to her memory, the weight of his body, the effort to keep him alive, and that final look before he lost consciousness, like he had something to say but couldn't. Every time a customer at the diner had dark hair and a chiseled jaw, she did a double take. Every time the bell over the door rang, her heart skipped a beat. But nothing ever came of it. One evening, while she was scrubbing trays in the back of Sunny Spoon, her manager approached. "Lena," he said, using the nickname the staff had given her, "how long you been with us now?" "About 3 weeks," she answered. "You're good, quick, reliable. But I heard you've been asking around about other jobs." She froze for a moment. "Only if I can get more hours," she lied. He nodded slowly. "We don't ask too many questions here. But immigration's been nosing around lately. Just be smart." She forced a polite smile, thanked him, then stepped outside for her break. She sat on the back steps, hugging her knees as the warm breeze swept through the alley. The sky above was clear, so different from that stormy night, but her chest still carried that same weight. She checked her phone. No missed calls, no emails, just a message from her mother filled with heart emojis and a blurry photo of her brother's latest school project. She typed a cheerful reply. "I'm doing well, Ma." But in truth, she didn't know how much longer she could go on like this, living in fear of losing everything. She had crossed an ocean with dreams of healing people, but now she was invisible, just another immigrant no one saw. That night, Celine sat by the window of her apartment, fingers tracing tiny droplets of moisture along the glass. Outside, the hum of the city was distant, muted. She thought about leaving, about going back home. About failure. About vanishing. But then her mind returned to him, the man bleeding in the rain. She had helped him. For 10 minutes that night, she had mattered. She had been who she was meant to be. And somehow that thought was enough to keep her going. A few days later, while she was refilling sugar jars behind the diner counter, the bell above the door chimed. Just another customer escaping the summer heat, she assumed, and offered a tired smile before going back to her task. But then she felt it, something shifted in the air. A stillness, the kind that demands your attention. She looked up. Her eyes locked with his. He stood just inside the doorway, tall, composed, wearing a dark suit that looked tailored. His hair was neatly styled, his leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder. But none of that mattered. It was his face, the face she remembered in the rain. Celine froze, her hand tightening around the sugar jar. He saw her, recognition widening his eyes, and for a beat, neither of them moved. Then, as if in slow motion, he walked toward her. Her spine straightened instinctively, heart thudding. "It's you," he said softly, stopping just a step away. His voice was lower than she remembered, steady but filled with awe. "You saved my life." She stared at him. What she managed. That night? The rain. You were there. You kept me alive. You remember that? How could I forget? He looked nothing like the broken man she'd knelt beside weeks ago. He was strong, vibrant, alive. "You made it," she whispered. "I did," he said gently. "Because of you." She glanced around, some customers had started watching. Setting the sugar jar down, she stepped out from behind the counter. "I wasn't sure you'd survive. They told me if I'd arrived 5 minutes later, I wouldn't have. They mentioned a woman who kept pressure on the wound, but no one got your name." "I'm Celine." He nodded. "I'm Mason. Mason Halberg." She nodded slowly. His name didn't mean much to her, but the weight of the moment did. "I tried to find out what happened," she said. "I called around, but no one would tell me anything." "I was looking for you too," he replied. "Ever since I woke up. I didn't know your name, but when I walked in and saw your face," he trailed off. It was like stepping back into that night. She didn't know what to say. He glanced around the diner. "Would you sit with me? Maybe I could buy you a coffee unless you're working." "I'm on break," she replied quietly. They sat by the window in a booth, both silent at first. Outside, the city carried on as usual, but something between them had shifted. "Are you okay now?" she asked. "Really okay?" He nodded with a faint smile. "I am now. It took a few surgeries, a long recovery, but yeah, I'm good." He looked at her more intently this time. "What about you? You're working here." She lowered her gaze. Just until something better comes along. You're not a waitress. She blinked, surprised. Excuse me? That night you had training. You knew exactly what to do. I used to be a nurse, she said softly, before I lost my job. Mason didn't ask why. He didn't press. He just nodded, eyes warm. You saved my life, he said again, more firmly this time. And I never really got to thank you. You just did, she said quietly. But somehow, she knew he wasn't finished. A few days after that encounter, Mason invited her to meet for coffee again. This time not at the diner, but at a cozy cafe tucked between two bookstores in the Arts District. The place was called Little Finch Cafe, with warm wood, soft jazz, and the scent of roasted beans hanging in the air. She arrived early, fussing with her thrift store blouse, still unsure if any of this was real. Then he walked in calm, self-assured, his usual softness in his smile. I'm really glad you came, he said, pulling out a chair for her. They chatted casually for a while about everything and nothing until a gentle pause settled between them. I think I should tell you who I really am, Mason said, his tone more serious. Celine looked puzzled. What do you mean? My name is Mason Halberg, yes, he said. But what I didn't mention is I'm the CEO of Halberg Medical Technologies. She stared at him. Halberg Medical, the biotech company making headlines in every healthcare journal? He nodded slowly. My father started it. After he passed, I took over. I've been running it for about 4 years now. Celine felt the breath leave her lungs. She'd seen that name before on conference brochures in medical newsletters. They were known for cutting-edge diagnostic tools and mobile monitoring systems. And the man she tried to keep alive on a rain-slicked street was running all of it. I don't get it, she said at last. What were you doing alone in an alley that night? I was lost, he answered, voice low. Not physically, mentally. I'd been throwing myself into work, non-stop meetings, acquisitions, strategies. I stopped connecting with people. That night I just walked. No car, no security. I needed air. The attack was random, they didn't know who I was. They didn't take anything. His fingers absently traced the rim of his cup. Lying there, bleeding, I remember thinking, so this is it. Alone, anonymous. And then you showed up. He looked up, steady now. You stayed. You didn't run. And everything changed after that. Celine didn't speak, her heartbeat was too loud in her ears. You pulled me back, he continued. While I was recovering, I kept thinking, what good is all this company, this power, if I'm not using it to do something that matters? He reached into his messenger bag and placed a sleek folder on the table, sliding it toward her. I'm launching a new branch under Halberg Medical, the Thrive Initiative. It'll focus on bringing primary healthcare to underserved communities. Mobile clinics, education programs, nurse-led teams. Celine opened the folder slowly. Inside were outlines, proposed locations, budgets. It was real. I want you to be part of it, Mason said. Not because you saved me, not out of obligation, but because I've never seen someone with instincts like yours. You're meant for this. She looked up. You don't even know me. I know enough. You stayed with a bleeding stranger. You work at a diner to survive, but you haven't given up on healing. I see you. She closed the folder, hands trembling slightly. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said softly. Let's build something that actually matters. The first time Celine walked into the downtown headquarters of the Thrive Initiative, she felt like her lungs could finally breathe again. The space buzzed with purpose. Nurses, public health experts, and project leads gathered in meeting rooms, planned outreach schedules, analyzed local health data. Her new role? Program Coordinator for Thrive Mobile, the initiative's first rollout of medical vans offering checkups, vaccinations, and follow-up care across high-need neighborhoods. The first week was intense, training, back-to-back meetings, late nights learning new digital systems, but Celine met every challenge with quiet tenacity. The fieldwork gave her life again. When she stepped into the first mobile unit, welcomed by a nervous grandmother with high blood pressure and a toddler wheezing in his mother's arms, it all clicked into place. She wasn't just taking vitals, she was giving people dignity. She was 30 now. Not the version of herself she imagined at this age, but something stronger. Someone remade. Every day brought someone new, a veteran sleeping in his car, a teen girl too scared to speak until Celine simply sat beside her and listened. The mobile team became like family, and with every successful visit, Celine's voice grew steadier. Her visa status was now secure. Her ideas started gaining traction. She even led a pilot program for chronic care support. Soon, local leaders and reporters began noticing. Mason checked in often. Sometimes professionally. Sometimes just with her favorite coffee and that slight, knowing smile. They worked late into the evenings, debating logistics, laughing at volunteer mishaps. Somewhere between grant proposals and community surveys, the air between them began to shift. He never made a move, never said anything out of place. But she felt it in how he stayed after meetings to ask how her day really went, in how he remembered the names of her patients, in how he waited for her to lead. She didn't dare name it yet, but it was there. One night, after a long day in Northside District, they sat in the back of a mobile van, sipping lukewarm coffee. The city lights outside were smeared with fatigue. I used to think I came to the U.S. to help people, Celine said, voice low. But I think now. I needed help too. Mason didn't answer right away. Then he said, you never needed help. You just needed someone to see you. They sat in quiet recognition. Not romantic, not quite, but something deeper. A sense of shared truth. Months passed. Celine developed a health literacy program. She trained volunteers, partnered with schools. The mobile units doubled. Outcomes improved. Then the headlines started. Diner to director, how one nurse is transforming community care. One afternoon, Celine was invited to speak at a citywide conference on healthcare innovation. As she stepped onto the stage of the Riverside Civic Center, she looked out over an auditorium filled with doctors, policymakers, and nonprofit leaders. And she wasn't afraid. She spoke not as someone broken by her past, but as someone shaped by it. She shared the night she lost her job, the man she saved, and the program they had built together. She didn't dramatize, it wasn't about heroics. It was about how compassion, grit, and belief could rebuild something from nothing. When she finished, the crowd rose in applause. Backstage, Mason was waiting. He didn't speak. He just opened his arms and she stepped into them without hesitation. In that embrace, Celine felt everything, the beginning, the loss, the hope, the transformation. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rising. The sky above Manila shimmered in golden tones as the plane descended. From her window seat, Celine gazed at the landscape of her childhood, lush fields, crisscrossing roads, rust-colored rooftops. It had been nearly 3 years since she'd last returned. But this time she wasn't coming home alone. Mason stepped beside her in the narrow terminal, adjusting to the humidity with a curious smile. So this is where it all started, he said. She smiled. It's not fancy, but it's everything to me. They traveled by bus through small villages, kids playing barefoot, sorry stores crowding the intersections. Mason grew quiet, watching it all unfold. When they arrived at her family's home, her mother was already outside, eyes brimming with tears. She wrapped Celine in a hug that could have held the whole world. Celine introduced Mason in gentle Tagalog, and though her mother only spoke basic English, she welcomed him with a warmth that needed no translation. That night, they sat cross-legged on woven mats under the stars, sharing grilled tilapia and bowls of steaming rice. Her younger brother, Mateo, asked Mason endless questions about New York and technology, while their mother told stories of Celine's childhood, how she'd tend to sick cats, pretend to run a clinic, and once bandaged her brother's scraped elbow like it was surgery. Mason listened to every word, not just politely, but with real reverence. Later, they walked through the village, lanterns glowing in windows, children playing games with bottle caps. Mason took her hand. I thought I understood you, he said quietly. But now, I really see you. She blinked. What do you mean? This place, these people, the way they love you, the way you treat them, every single one, with that same kindness. She looked down, shy. It's just how I grew up. No, he said, squeezing her hand. It's who you are. The next morning, they visited the only health post in the area. A one-room concrete structure with peeling walls, flickering lights, and a single overworked nurse doing triage for an entire town. Celine had warned him, but Mason still looked shaken. Outside, he stood quietly for a long while, then turned to her. What if we built something here? Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? A real clinic. With supplies. A team. Preventive programs. Something that honors your roots and gives this place what it deserves. Her breath caught. You do that. With you. For them. For you. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't have to do this just because. I'm not doing it just because I love you, he said. I'm doing it because loving you means loving all the parts that made you. She couldn't speak. She just reached for his hand, holding it tight under the rising sun. The warm scent of steamed rice and lemongrass tea filled the kitchen as Celine packed a woven basket with medical supplies. Outside, Mason was in the garden speaking with volunteers who had agreed to help clear land for the new clinic. Everything felt aligned, like purpose and peace had finally met. Then her phone rang. It was Mason's assistant from New York. His voice was tight, urgent. A serious internal breach had occurred. Data had been leaked from a critical division at Halberg Medical. The media had caught wind. Investors were panicking. The board needed Mason back immediately. When the call ended, Mason's shoulders had stiffened. The village still glowed in morning calm, but the weight of the world had returned to him. He found Celine rinsing vegetables at the water pump. "I have to go back," he said softly. She turned to him slowly. "How bad?" "Bad enough to threaten everything, the company, the foundation. I have to face it." "I'll go with you," she said without hesitation. But he gently took her hand. "You don't have to." "I want to." "But your mom," Mason said, glancing toward the small home where Celine's mother folded laundry on the porch, "she needs you. And you've just started laying the groundwork for the clinic. These people need you, too." Celine looked down, heart-torn. "You're not asking me to choose. But I still feel like I'm being pulled in two directions." Mason cupped her face gently, his gaze steady. "Then let's not tear anything. Let's do this the way we've done everything together, even if we're apart." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. "You think we'll make it?" "I know we will." They stood in silence under the soft hum of morning in the village. Roosters crowed in the distance. A tricycle buzzed by. Somewhere, a child laughed. Life continued, but change was coming. "I'll stay," Celine said at last. "Until the clinic's running. Until Ma's stronger. I owe her that much." "And I'll fix what needs fixing," Mason replied. "Then I'll come back. Or you'll come to me. We'll find each other again." They held each other, not with sorrow, but with the calm strength of two people choosing the same future, even on separate paths. At the airport, Celine stood by the gate as Mason prepared to board. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, and lingered for a moment, as though trying to pause time. "Remember," he whispered, "this is just one chapter." "I know," she said, smiling through tears. "I'll see you soon." As he disappeared down the terminal, she repeated the words to herself. "I'll see you soon." Back in the village, the sun rose gently over the hillside, casting golden light across the newly completed clinic. It stood proud and humble, a white and blue structure with clean lines and wide windows. Over the entrance were painted the words, "Kalayaan Wellness Center, Kalayaan Freedom." The name had been Celine's idea. Villagers arrived in their finest clothes, some with woven baskets of food, others carrying fresh flower garlands and homemade signs. Children ran barefoot through the grass, laughter echoing. It wasn't just the grand opening of a clinic. It was the celebration of hope, of healing, and of a woman who had come home transformed. Celine stood at the steps of the clinic in a simple sea-colored dress. Her mother held her hand tightly, while Mateo adjusted chairs beneath the canopy for the guests. It had taken nearly a year, grants, designs, fundraising, and sleepless nights, but they had done it. And though Mason had not returned in person, he had remained present. In donation letters, in video calls, in every encouraging message he sent from afar. "Miss Celine," the mayor called, stepping onto the small wooden stage. "Come, this is your moment." She approached the microphone, hands trembling only slightly. "I came back with nothing but a vision," she began. "This place was built not with wealth or status, but with care, with the belief that everyone deserves to be seen, to be treated with dignity, and to be healed." Applause rippled through the crowd. "I dedicate this clinic to every mother who walked for hours to find medicine, to every child who waited for help that never came, and to everyone who believes that healing can begin anywhere, even in the smallest corners of the world." She stepped back as shining. But the moment wasn't over yet. Suddenly, the music shifted. A hush spread across the crowd as someone appeared at the edge of the gathering. Tall, familiar. Celine froze. Mason. He wore a light linen shirt and dark slacks, his hair tousled by travel, but his expression, those eyes, were exactly as she remembered them. Their gazes locked across the space, and it was as if time folded in on itself. He walked slowly toward her, villagers parting to let him through, their whispers carrying behind him. In one hand, he held something small. As the applause swelled again, Mason stepped onto the stage. The mayor, sensing what was coming, stepped aside with a knowing smile. Mason turned to the crowd, then to Celine. "Most of you don't know me," he said into the microphone. But this woman saved my life, not just by keeping me breathing on a rainy street, but by reminding me what a meaningful life truly looks like. He turned fully to face her now, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Gasps and whispers rippled through the audience. He knelt. Celine's hands flew to her mouth, tears already rising. The woman who once saved my life, Mason said, his voice catching, would you let me spend the rest of mine with you? The crowd erupted in cheers, applause, and joyful laughter. Celine's knees gave way and she knelt beside him, her hands on his face, nodding through her tears. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. The moment held still, the wind, the sun, the people, it all glowed with the kind of joy that lives in stories. There was music, dancing, and petals tossed into the air by children. The village celebrated not just a clinic, but a love story that had survived storms, borders, and silence. As evening came and lanterns floated into the sky, Celine stood on the clinic steps beside Mason. She leaned into him and whispered, you didn't just give me a future. You brought me home. As Mason kissed her hand, the words above the clinic door glowed softly in the golden light of dusk. Love doesn't need to find a perfect place, it begins from the most sincere place, from a giving heart. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the feeling lingered like the warmth of the sun held in memory. Celine and Mason stayed on the steps, their fingers intertwined, watching as lanterns drifted into the twilight sky. There were no more speeches, no more promises to make. They had already kept the ones that mattered. This was not the end. It was the start of something rooted, honest, and deeply earned, a love born not from perfection, but from persistence, compassion, and grace. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of love, sacrifice, and second chances.